Hello, and welcome to Brown University. Please take this opportunity to turn off all mobile devices for the duration of the event. All or portions of this event and its participants may be captured by photography or video and used for news or promotional purposes. Standing or sitting in the aisles is not permitted. Smoking is not permitted inside any building on Brown's campus. In the event of an emergency, please walk calmly and quickly to one of the marked exits and move away from the building. Thank you for your cooperation.
Welcome to Research Matters. I'm glad to see all of you here. Thank you so much for coming out at the end of your day. I'm Vanessa Ryan, Co-Deputy Dean and Associate Dean of Student Development in the Graduate School. This is one of my favorite events. It's a moment to celebrate the research of scholars who are the next generation of faculty, of leaders, and of innovators. Our focus today is on the work of early career scholars. We have so many occasions to celebrate our students when they graduate, to celebrate their achievements after they leave us here on campus. What makes today special is that we're shining a spotlight on them now during their studies, allowing them to share with you what they are contributing every day to research at Brown and to the world, and they're doing so in their own voices. So today we're also asking them something different. We're asking them to step out of that deep disciplinary learning and scholarship to share with us why their research matters. They're going to make it look easy, and it's not at all. To communicate deep, technical research to an interdisciplinary audience, to make your research accessible, that's one of the hardest challenges faced by all of us scholars. So from many nominations, then a semifinal round, we chose students at all stages of their research. So we have students concluding their master's study to completing their doctoral degrees. Some are practiced public speakers and are no stranger to the stage, whereas others are really stepping onto this stage only because of the passion for what they do. A few of our speakers were nominated in 2020 and were ready to present at our Spring 2020 Research Matters. But unfortunately, you know what happened in that semester, and we had to put Research Matters on hold until now. So that makes me especially glad today that we're back together, and we're also on live stream, so I welcome all of you watching online as well. So it's my honor today to introduce two important people. First, I'm going to introduce our Master of Ceremonies, Jeremy or JJ Lomax. JJ, or I should say Dr. Lomax, Dr. Lomax recently defended his PhD in the Department of Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences. I had the pleasure of getting to know Dr. Lomax a few years ago. He presented at Research Matters 2019, and I encourage you to go view his amazing talk titled, "My Mother Calls Me a Fish Dentist." It's a gem. JJ has given a lot to the graduate community in his time here, and we can't wait to see what happens next. Now is my pleasure to introduce the Dean of the Graduate School, Andrew Campbell. He's the 15th Dean of the Graduate School and Professor of Medical Science. He knows why research matters. His research focuses on microbial diseases, particularly infectious diseases in neglected populations and regions. He has taught and advised Brown undergraduate and graduate students since his faculty appointment in 1994. And he has served as director of the university's pathobiology program, the Marine Biological Laboratory graduate program. He has also long been recognized as a leader in graduate education. He leads, for example, the NIH-funded Initiative to Maximize Student Development, a program that has significantly improved recruiting and support of underrepresented students in doctoral programs. I'm delighted he can kick off our event today.
Okay, so hi everyone. It's good to see all of you here in person, and we're also glad for everyone who is online. We're glad that you're joining us. So thank you very much, Vanessa, for the introductions, and I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone who is here. Thank you for coming out and being here at this important event after a pause, our 2020 pause. So it's really good to start this event in this post-COVID, what I call this post-COVID era. I'm especially grateful to those of you who nominated our speakers for today's session and recognize their potential and are encouraging them to really share their research in ways that I think we all will appreciate. And of course, thank you to our speakers. I know it's not easy to sort of, as Vanessa says, step out of the depth of your discipline, but to present your work in a way that's, if you will, digestible to everyone and understandable to a very broad audience, which we have here. I also want to thank Vice President Jill Pfeiffer's office and her staff for supporting this and the work that we do here in the graduate school. I also realize that there are other folks in the audience. Some of you are masked, so you're a little bit incognito, but I know there are many faculty members here, and I know I can recognize, because they're very close to me, a number of the deans from the graduate school, Alicia Mosley Austin, of course, Vanessa Ryan, and let me just point out Vanessa. Vanessa does a tremendous amount of work, and so this is one of her signature programs, so I think we should give her a big hand and everyone else who's helped to get this program going. Associate Dean Tal Lewis, future dean, interim dean of the graduate school. And Dean Maria Suarez is also here to support everyone here and cheer everyone on. So this is an exciting time at the graduate school. We continue to attract some of the best, no, not some, the best and the brightest scholars to the institution from around the world. This year, as in past years, and I'm very, very proud to say this, in the time that I've been dean of the graduate school, we've seen record numbers of applications, record numbers of admits. And so I always say, when you see record numbers of applications, it means that people want to be here. Okay, and you create this community, this environment that folks want to be in. And we had a record number of admits, and to me that's comforting, because the people who are here, the people who make decisions, who want you to be their research partners and scholars, want you here. And then finally, the people who come here because they feel that this is the place for them to really pursue their scholarship. And so we're talking about individuals who are historically have been underrepresented in the academy, underrepresented individuals, women, international students. We're talking about individuals who really want to be here to subscribe to graduate education here at Brown as we provide it. As Vanessa says, we do a good job. I think we do an excellent job training the next generation of scholars and scientists, and we recognize how important, how vital you are to the academy and beyond. Some of you will remain in the academy, some of you will move outside of the academy, but wherever you go, I think the work that you do will be very much appreciated. For those of you who are watching the individuals who are presenting today, I think they represent really great examples and models, and hopefully some of you in the audience will step up next year and also participate. The interesting thing I want to say really is that oftentimes when we think about research, especially in some disciplines, it's often seen as this solitary and monastic experience that really takes place in these spaces that folks don't have access to, and sometimes written in language that not everyone understands, and often published in journals that people don't really read, which is a little bit unfair. I think it's a little bit unfair. So that's why events like this, I think, are critically important, because this is how you bring your work and you share your work with a larger community. And I think we have a responsibility to do just that. The scholarship that you do is scholarship and work that should be shared with the general public and everyone at large. So I want to now turn things over to JJ and have him get us started on our program. I'm really excited. There are a lot of folks here who I know, some folks whose work I've seen and I haven't heard, so I'm looking forward to this. I hope you're looking forward to it as much as I am, and it's so good to see all of you again. So before we start the program, let's give everyone a hand to just energize them, and at the end we'll give them a hand. So.
Thank you for that, Dean Campbell. I am very happy to announce that I am Dr. Jeremy Jelani Lomax. Yes, thank you. Yes, graduate of Brown University and a recipient of the PhD from the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology here at Brown. And yeah, it's going to be a fun night. I remember my time at Research Matters, and there's something about being able to take this space and just talk about work that means so much to you in a way that is accessible to any and everybody and gives you a chance to get people excited about some obscure topics like, I don't know, fish chewing. But nonetheless, I'm not here to talk about myself today. I would like to just take a second to join Dean Kimball and Vanessa Ryan in thanking you all for joining us today and picking this space for us to have a second to hear about some of this research. It's a beautiful room on a beautiful campus, and this area here at Brown is also just immaculately, I guess, upkept and held. And so I personally want to take a second to just thank the Narragansett tribe for being good stewards of this land. And so before we get started, I just want to take a second to say that. But without further ado, I know we're all here to hear about why everyone's research matters, and the Research Matters Selection Committee worked extremely hard to select the students that are going to be speaking with us today. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Arit Ahuja, who is a doctoral candidate in neuroscience. Arit's talk today is going to be entitled, "It's All in Your Head, Simulation in the Primate Brain." Please welcome Arit.
Here's a question I want to start with. How are you able to imagine things in your head? Let's go on a little journey together. Imagine you're driving up Brook Street, you're trying to get to the Fonz Arch on the main green, and as you get close to campus, you encounter construction, road work blocking your path. I mean, this is Providence after all. You stop and you start to think, maybe I could turn right here, get onto a parallel street, go up a few, but you know what? No, there's actually a bunch of one-ways and dead ends there, so that's not the best. Maybe I go left here, that takes me down to Prospect. I go north on Prospect, I hit Waterman, I turn right, and there you go. I'm at the Fonz Arch. Now, amazingly, all of this happens entirely inside your head. You can simulate potential paths and seem able to visualize them. Crucially, these mental simulations, if you will, they allow you to imagine, often in vivid visual detail, how things might play out in the future so as to allow you to solve everyday problems. And because of this, mental simulation is probably one of the most sophisticated cognitive abilities available at your disposal. Now, as a neuroscientist, that interests me for two reasons. One, I want to know what's going on in your brain when you carry out these mental simulations. And two, I want to know if this ability is uniquely human. So that's really what my research in our lab focuses on. Now, at this stage, you might be wondering, how does one even study mental simulation in a lab? Well, to do so, I have designed a simple cognitive task that can prompt someone to carry out a simulation. Here's how it works. Using computer software, I can design displays like this one, comprised of a ball at the top, several randomly arranged obstructors throughout the middle, and then these two catchers at the bottom, one on the left, one on the right. And the way it works is that I show people displays like this, and I ask them, if I were to drop that ball right now, which of the two catchers do you think it's going to land into? Or right. The idea being that one could simulate the ball's trajectory in order to arrive at the answer, not unlike the simulation you and I just carried out together to get to the Fonz Arch. Once I have trained somebody to do this task, I ask them to perform it while lying inside an MRI scanner. And I can use the MRI machine to not only determine the structure of someone's brain, I can also measure patterns of neural activity in their brain as they're doing this task. And looking at this pattern of activity, what I find is that when people attempt to simulate the ball's trajectory, their brains respond as if they were in fact literally seeing the ball fall, even though at the time that they carry out the simulation, the ball isn't moving. So in other words, what that means is that sort of vivid envisioning feeling you can perhaps relate to, where you feel like you can see in your mind's eye the thing that you're simulating, you feel that way because that's kind of what's actually happening in your brain. And this brings me to the second question. Is this ability uniquely human? Now, in order to tackle this side of things, I have tried to train rhesus macaque monkeys, not unlike this guy right here, to also do that same ball fall task. And to be quite honest, when I first started, I was pretty skeptical, and I didn't really think that the monkeys were going to be able to learn it. Much to my surprise, not only are they able to learn it, but they're actually really good at it. And so that has provided me with this rather rare and unique opportunity to study their brains in a non-invasive way by having them do this task while also inside an MRI scanner. And that brings me to what I consider to be the best part. Just like with humans, we find that when monkeys attempt to simulate the ball's trajectory, their brains also respond as if they were in fact perceiving the ball fall, even though, again, all they have to do is predict the final location where the ball is going to end up. And the reason I consider that to be so exciting is because it serves as biological proof for the fact that monkeys can envision potential futures, and it situates this complex cognitive ability of ours in the context of its evolutionary history. All right, so I've shared all these things that I think are really exciting, but at the end of the day, why does all of this research really matter? Well, I started by talking about how simulation is this, complex cognitive phenomenon, but there's also a flip side where in conditions like PTSD or schizophrenia, simulated representations of the world can become hyper-vivid and involuntarily triggered to the point where they manifest as hallucination. How do we help people experiencing these conditions? Research like this that looks at the neural mechanisms of cognitive phenomena and bridges them between humans and animals, it can lay the foundation for clinical research aimed at testing and devising therapies for people who experience simulation in a dysfunctional way. This future avenue, and many like it, are made possible by the research that I have shared with you today. All we have to do now is simulate a path to the answers. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Arit. I'm not gonna lie, I was instantly envisioning playing Pong with a macaque monkey, but nonetheless, very groundbreaking work. Our next speaker is Sarah Christensen, and Sarah is a doctoral candidate in history. Today she speaks to us about her research in a talk entitled Emotional Histories of Enslaved Women in Early Medieval Europe. Please join me in welcoming Sarah.
Once upon a time, there was a princess named Melkorka. She lived in Ireland in the time after St. Patrick had driven away all the snakes, but before the English came to conquer. She lived with her father, the King Merciartan, in a fort by the coast. And one day, Melkorka was walking in the village when she saw in the distance a number of ships run aground on the beach and their crews spill out onto the sand. When Melkorka saw that the men were carrying axes, she felt a terrible dread. The men descended upon the village, killing any who stood against them and catching the women and children who tried to flee. Melkorka and other girls she knew were dragged down to the beach, had their wrists tied with rope, were lifted into the ships, and were carried away on the waves. Countless women like Melkorka were enslaved in early medieval Europe between about the 6th and the 12th centuries. My research explores the emotional experience of enslavement during this period, once known as the Dark Ages. Historians don't call it that anymore, and neither should any of you, but there is one aspect of this period that still lies largely in shadow, and that is the lives and feelings of the women who were captured, transported, and sold as slaves across the European continent and beyond. When historians in the past have studied medieval slavery, they're usually studying an economic institution populated by male agricultural laborers and determining whether these men should be called slaves or serfs. Yet increasingly, scholars acknowledge that the vast majority of people enslaved in the medieval world were women. And when scholars study medieval emotion, they're usually studying a vocabulary used by kings and bishops in their books and letters. Rather than studying the writings of elite men or examining the intricacies of debts and revenues, my work illuminates the emotional histories of the women who labored in domestic and sexual slavery in elite households across medieval Europe. I push the boundaries of our approach to medieval emotion by finding feeling in a sparse array of scattered textual and material fragments that offer glimpses into these women's inner lives. Medieval historians are pretty good at doing a lot with a little, but when it comes to the study of slavery, we have even less than a little. We have next to none of the usual sources of emotional language, like diaries or correspondences or poems or prayers. What we have are brief mentions in estate surveys, legal texts, and some prose narratives. So, for example, Melkorka, the Irish princess, is a character in a saga from 13th century Iceland, one of the only medieval European sources in which an enslaved woman is depicted narrating her own history of capture and sale. Yet, what Melkorka actually says in the saga is incredibly short. The saga reads, "I am called Melkorka, my father is called Merkjartan, he was a king in Ireland, and I was taken from there when I was 15 years old." Because enslaved people were forcibly displaced from their homelands, they had few possessions and left only very rare material traces that defy easy interpretation. So, for example, on the Danish island of Bornholm, archaeologists studying fragments of pottery from the 11th century have identified a shift in technique from a Scandinavian to a Slavic manufacture style, suggesting the sudden arrival of a new labor force around the same time that slave-taking was increasing in the Slavic lands. Similarly, cloth can tell us a tale of demographic change in Iceland. So decaying bits of textiles studied by researchers at Brown's Hafenreffer Museum suggest a shift in spinning style from a Scandinavian to an Irish style around the same time that Melkorka may have been captured and brought to Iceland. These tiny fragments of evidence lead me to wonder what was life like for the women who entered these Danish or Icelandic workshops and who brought with them their own habits and their own histories. The question that my research seeks to answer is, how do we use these sparse sources, these brief lines of text or pieces of cloth or pottery, to build an emotional history of an almost invisible demographic? And for me, the answer lies partly in imagining. What might have happened? How may it have felt to arrive in an unknown land among a strange people, to work as a nurse or a maid or a weaver or a potter under the wandering eye of an entitled master or the vicious hand of a jealous mistress? I push the boundaries of what we can know about the feelings of marginalized peoples long past. By reimagining stories like Melkorka's, I hope to show that enslaved women in early medieval Europe survived and subverted their circumstances and altered their newfound worlds. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Sarah. Very compelling work, and I appreciate you taking the time to share the stories of some of these women. Our next speaker today is going to be Ethan Kissevet. Ethan is a doctoral candidate in Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences. Today he's going to be speaking with us about his research, mapping the Arctic's changing wetlands. Please join me in welcoming Ethan.
I am a swamp cartographer. And what I mean by that is I study the geography of wetlands, those low-lying areas that are covered by shallow water and wet soils, also known as mud, for some or all of the year. And I do this because these areas are the largest natural source of the greenhouse gas methane. And unlike the other human sources, we don't have a lot of control over the natural emissions, so they're very hard to predict. And globally, we don't have a very detailed picture of where exactly these wetlands lie and exactly how much area they take up. So my research is motivated by a simple principle. We can't count how much of something there is if we don't know where it is. So this is a peatland pond in Alberta, Canada, that I visited in 2018 with my lab. That's me, the inflatable raft, taking water samples. My group is part of a decade-long NASA project to look at the changing Arctic. And so every summer, a suite of research aircraft fly the same path over Arctic Canada and Alaska, carrying on board sophisticated imaging technology like cameras, spectrometers, and radars. Whenever we're in the field, we try to have a team on the ground underneath to take what is known as ground truth measurements, the measurements that can only be taken in situ rather than from the air. And because we're trying to measure the coverage of lakes and wetlands, for us this involves donning our chest waders and walking along the shorelines of these water bodies, one boot in the water, one boot on land, and a handheld GPS in our wader pockets. Back in the lab, it's my job to disentangle all these meandering GPS tracks and field observations and drone photos like the image I just showed to make what are known as training data sets, which I then use to put into machine learning models that I run on the airborne imagery so that we can predict coverage of lakes and wetlands, even in areas we haven't yet visited. Carbon scientists are interested in the gas methane because it has a global warming impact 25 times as great as its better-known cousin, carbon dioxide, although it's only present in the atmosphere in smaller concentrations. In the Arctic, the fate of methane is closely intertwined with that of permafrost, which is frozen ground that remains frozen throughout the year, even throughout the summer, because it lies so far north. And as you know, the permafrost is thawing, and it's exposing carbon-containing sediments that have been buried in ice for tens of thousands of years since the last ice age. And all these sediments are fast becoming bacteria food, and the metabolic byprocess of this decomposition is the greenhouse gas methane. And this process is known as the permafrost carbon feedback. The hotter it gets, the more greenhouse gases are released, and therefore, the hotter it gets. So you have lakes like this one. This sits on thawing permafrost in Alaska, and it was photographed by a scientist at the University of Alaska in 2007, which probably explains the grainy footage taken from a flip phone, most likely. And what this is showing is that the conditions for methane production are so excellent underneath this lake that it's literally bubbling to the surface like methane kombucha. So the job of the swamp cartographer here is to try and figure out where the other lakes like this are. Where are the high sources of methane emission? And let me tell you, they're not all this obvious. The field of limnology, which seeks to study freshwater science, has traditionally been focused on the world's largest lakes, the ones that are most important for fishing and commerce and transportation. And these are the 40 largest ones drawn to scale. The peatland pond I showed earlier would hardly be a pinprick on this map. Yet it's actually the smallest lakes that are the greatest source of methane on a per area basis. And these are the ones that are the hardest to image from satellites. It wasn't until recently that we could even resolve lakes smaller than about the size of a football field. And by my estimate, there's about 300 million of these lakes in the world. So the challenge, my process for solving this challenge, is using modern high-resolution imagery from both satellite and airborne sources to get very accurate maps of the exact extents of lakes and wetlands. I'll leave you with this mosaic of lakes that I visited that summer in Alberta. Many of them are below this football field limit and thus wouldn't have been observable from the satellites that can see our most remote areas of the Earth. Each one of them has its own environmental history in its sediments and waters below. Modern climate models can not only resolve the projected human emissions of greenhouse gases, but also natural emissions such as methane from aquatic systems like these. So I hope that my research is important because I help inform the wetland maps that work for these models that are our best estimate of how climate change will play out in the coming decades.
It's very nice to know that we don't have to be worried about cows. Thank you, Ethan. Our next speaker is none other than Joseph Hefner. Joey is a doctoral candidate in cognitive, linguistic, and psychological sciences. Joey speaks with us today about economic inequality corrupts moral standards. Please join me in welcoming Joey.
I feel like not a day goes by where I don't see an article or see a media piece about the rising inequality in the United States. And this is because we live in an unprecedented era where 3 individuals can own more wealth than the bottom half of the country. Now, numerous studies have been done on the health and societal effects of rising inequality, but as a psychologist, I wondered about the psychological effects that it has on people. People live their lives with moral beliefs and moral standards that they have, but rising inequality may make it difficult to maintain these standards. And so what happens? My research investigates the extent that rising inequality and the effect it has on our moral character. Now, to give you an analogy, I want you to imagine a situation in which tomorrow you find out you've just won the lottery. How do you think your life would change? Well, obviously you'd be a lot richer, but do you think it would fundamentally change your moral character? Perhaps before winning the lottery, you believed that people ought to give 10% of their income to charity, which is a standard that's common across many religious practices. Would you continue to do so? After all, 10% of those lottery winnings is a lot of money, and you might give a little less or perhaps none at all. This is the scenario that I recreated in the lab experimentally in order to study how inequality affects people's ability to maintain those moral standards. Across many studies now, I bring people into lab to play games with real monetary consequences. If you are a participant in one of my studies, I would pair you up with another individual and give you a random endowment, kind of like winning the lottery. So sometimes you get a little bit, but sometimes you get a lot. And with this money, you have a choice to donate some of it to a public good. And in the real world, public goods are the things that things like taxation provides. So these are the libraries, the roads, and the bridges that everyone gets to enjoy and use. In our game, it's not so different. Any amount contributed to the public good is increased by 150% and then redistributed evenly to both partners. So like taxes, you would prefer to shirk on your responsibility, but of course the system only works when everyone contributes their fair share. Now the situation I described is one of equality, but sometimes participants were given a lot less than their partner, and sometimes they were given a lot more. After describing all these rules, I asked participants a very simple question. How much will you contribute to the public good? And this has to be done before they find out how much money they're going to be given. So it's given as a percentage. They can say 0% all the way up to 100%, any amount they want. And it's completely private and non-binding. It's just an opportunity to reflect on the moral standards that they have for themselves in this cooperative context. Now, the results I'm going to show you today have 2 profound and striking discoveries. First, we can examine how overall inequality affects cooperation. So we have situations of equality, when both partners are given the same amount, to unequal contribution, unequal endowments, which is when one partner has a lot more than the other. And we're looking as a function of the amount that people gave to the public good out of their total endowment. So we can see that inequality powerfully drives cooperation, such that when things are the most unequal, this is the least value creation in terms of our public institutions. So inequality is driving down cooperation, but not all inequality is created equal. So we can also examine the situations when you were poorer, had the same amount, or richer than your partner. And now we're looking at it as a function of your ability to keep that moral standard you made for yourself. So if you're able to keep it, your data would fall along the red dashed line, and to the extent that you gave less than you said you would, we would be going downwards on the graph. So when you're poorer than your partner, you do actually give a little bit less than you said you would, but it's a pretty small effect. And importantly, when people have the same amounts, people actually give a little more than their moral standards. It's almost as if it makes us better people. What about situations when you're richer? Well, when you're richer, inequality powerfully drives behavior, such that people are much more likely to break those pledges, and this is because wealth creates moral hypocrites. It provides an incentive to systematically lower your moral standards to be in line with your newfound financial status. Now, in science, no set of studies has all the answers, but I think these results tell a compelling story that economic inequality corrupts moral standards. In our society, people vehemently argue for egalitarian and pro-social motives, and I have no doubt that everyone in the audience would do so today. But these results suggest if we were to come into a sudden windfall, that we would lower the same moral standards, the one we consider intrinsic to our very being, to account for this newfound status. I believe my research matters because I believe policymakers and citizens should understand the effects of the rising inequality that we're experiencing and how it corrupts our internal moral compasses for the worse. Thank you.
The game of Monopoly makes so much more sense now. Thank you, Joey. Our next speaker is Alison Ventimiglia. Alison is a master's student in biotechnology. Alison's talk is entitled Bacteriophages, a micro solution to a macro problem. Please join me in welcoming Alison.
Hello, everybody. I hope that you're all doing well. In fact, I'm going to ask you a question to sort of
Let me just check it. On. Can we all welcome Alison again?
Sorry, everybody. Technical difficulties. I guess like an event would not be so without some. But yeah, let me get back to asking you all a question just to check your pulse and see if we're all alive and fit. My first question is, how many of you have been to the doctor's office and without much investigation or even diagnoses were prescribed some type of antibiotic, amoxicillin, doxycycline, and I get a raise of hands out there? Okay, that's quite a few of you in this room. My second question, and I'll give you two, is how many of you have seen Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius growing up as a kid? Okay, awesome. A lot more than I had anticipated. So let me go back to this first question, and I'll tie those two together for you, I promise. My first question, although that moment that you guys had those antibiotics prescribed to you seemed innocuous, is actually leading us to the current predicament of antibiotic resistance that we're currently facing. So what is antibiotic resistance? You probably are asking me right now. Antibiotic resistance is the evasion mechanisms that bacteria have co-evolved in order to combat our first lines of care, namely antibiotics. And it is a major, major, major issue. In fact, a forecasting report conducted by the UN found that by 2050, if nothing is done, a person will die every 3 seconds. Every 3 seconds, an individual will die. So that means that if I took the full 5 minutes to do this talk, that 100 individuals would die. Now those are really some stark numbers. What are some key players in this war we find ourselves in? Well, we have methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, also known more commonly as MRSA, multi-drug-resistant Pseudomonas aeruginosa, also known as MDR, P. aeruginosa, and carbapenem-resistant Endobacteriaceae, also known as nitric bacteria. Now, do you know the street cred that you have to have in order to be called nitric bacteria? These infections, they are not fun. But then again, no infection is fun. But these are particularly nasty. In fact, the WHO found, and I'm talking about the World Health Organization, I'm not talking about the band, the WHO found that out of all 43 antibiotics within the current 2021 pipeline, none were able to address the issue of superbugs. So what do? We currently find ourselves at a therapeutic deficit and a major problem that we're currently facing. So that brings me back to my second question about Jimmy Neutron. I remember vividly as a kid watching an episode of Jimmy Neutron, and he had shrunk himself down to a microscopic size. And he was fighting these entities that had these sort of like icosahedral-like heads and tails, and these like spindly little fibers coming off that kind of look like spiders. And as he was combating them, they were combating bacteria. These entities, I would later find out, are called bacteriophages. And they're part of the 27 new antibacterials that the World Health Organization considers we put our resources into. And that's where my research really starts. Bacteriophages are viruses, now don't get scared, that only infect bacteria. And they're particularly good at doing this because they've been able to co-evolve with bacteria. We've known of their existence since pre-1920s, so pre-penicillin, but they haven't been used yet in clinical settings. So you might be asking me, well, if these things are so great, why haven't we used them yet? And that's because we haven't found a way to effectively implement this theory. And so my work looks at putting these bacteriophages into a bacteria-responsive hydrogel. A hydrogel is a hydrophilic polymer network, and you all are probably like fancy words, what? Well, you've probably known them. They're commonly used in Band-Aids and contact lenses, this type of material. And the particular biomaterial that's within my lab only responds to a bacterial infection. So if there is no bacterial infection present, depending on the enzyme the bacteria are released, it will not release its therapy. So we can finally take ownership and stewardship of how we're delivering therapies. So my job is to make sure that these bacteriophages are comfortable. So I'm testing them with pH, with buffers, I'm looking at their size, and I'm making sure that they're able to be loaded into this hydrogel in the most effective manner so that they can take us onto so they can be loaded into a wound dressing as their little chariot to take us into a post-antibiotic era, not with fear, but with faith.
Thank you so much. The next Alexander Fleming, no doubt. And I appreciate the reminder to, always wash your hands. Okay, our next speaker today is going to be Danielle Bloom. Danny is a doctoral candidate in chemistry, and today she's going to be talking to us about the art of fingerprinting air air pollution. The art of fingerprinting air pollution. Please join me today in welcoming Danny.
The art of fingerprinting air pollution lies within the neutron, the non-charged part of an atom. Neutrons have different weights, called isotopes, and these very slight differences in weight can forensically tell us where air pollution is coming from. Using isotopes to trace chemicals isn't new. Anthropologists use it to determine where someone lived during their lives, and we can even use isotopes to trace manufactured goods back to their country of origin, like illegal drugs or even bottled water. But using isotopes to trace air pollution, well, that's about 20 years old. For science, this field is an infant, and there's still a lot left to understand. One of the misconceptions about air pollution is that it stays near where it's produced. And sometimes that is true, like in Salt Lake City, Utah. This city is surrounded by mountain regions and has a lot of factories. So a lot of the air pollution that is made here stays here, trapped by the topography, leaving the city in almost perpetual smog. But air pollution doesn't always stay near the source. This is a weather pattern moving along the jet stream, and we can use this to kind of visualize how air pollution might move from one place to another. In 2017, New England sued the Midwest because air pollution was proven to have traveled from the Midwest all the way to New England and deposited here. But because air pollution is so mobile, it's harder to trace. And what we absolutely do not want to do is accuse someone of producing pollution that didn't. Think of it like criminal forensics. We need to make sure that the fingerprint accurately matches the suspect, or we end up accusing the wrong person and punishing them unjustly. This is what I do. I make sure that the fingerprint accurately matches the suspect. So when the Midwest emits all of this air pollution and it goes through chemical change and transport and deposits here in Providence, in our ground and in our water, we can figure out where that pollution came from, and we can figure out which pollutant is causing the most harm. In the Hastings lab, we focus mostly on nitrogen pollution.
Nitrogen is a food for plants, which sounds good on paper, but we need to remember that not all plants benefit us. This image is of a severe algae bloom fueled by nitrogen pollution. And when algae blooms like this, it consumes so much oxygen in the water that there isn't a whole lot left for other aquatic species, and massive amounts of fish die. Algae blooms are bad for water ecosystems. They're bad for water quality, the water you and I drink, and they're even bad for the economy, affecting tourist trades and fishing incomes. I figure out how best to capture air pollution. I figure out what will and will not affect the fingerprint. The environment is unpredictable. It's dirty. There are so many variables that can affect how we lift that fingerprint. Changes in humidity, in temperature, even in how much or how little pollution is present will affect how well we lift that fingerprint. Most of my days look like this. I spend every day in the lab changing one variable at a time to figure out which ones will or will not affect how we collect air pollution. So when other scientists are out chasing wildfires and climbing 20 feet in the air over open water to collect these air pollution samples, they know that they aren't risking their health and their safety for nothing, because these samples are good. They will show a great, they will be good samples. And that is why my research matters.
Let's give another round of applause.
Way to go, Danny.
Never considered the whodunit of air pollution, so I appreciate you taking the time to figure that out for us. We now invite everyone to take a second to just mingle and chat. We'll be going into a quick intermission. So please have light refreshments out in the lobby, as no food and drinks are going to be permitted as you come back inside. We ask that you do stick around for the next session, though, following the reception, and we're excited to share the research and passion of the rest of the graduate students that will be participating in the second half. We will see you back here in 15 minutes, but for now, please take a second, stretch your legs, enjoy.
Congratulations. It's going great. Of course.
We started off with a neuroscientist.
There we did. There we did. It's awesome. It's good. I'm glad you're back in here.
1, 2. Check, check, check. Check 1, 2. Hey, hey, check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Check 1, 2, 3, 4. Hey, hey. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Check, check. Check 1, 2, 3, 4. Hey, hey. Check, check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hey, hey.
think it's cool.
Give everyone a second to just get back to their seats. Thanks so much for joining us for the second half. Okay, welcome back to the second session of Research Matters. Our next speaker, Danielle Williamson, is a doctoral student in religious studies. His talk today is entitled Between Faith and Despair. Please join me in welcoming Danielle. Oh, I am so sorry. I was so excited to get started that I did not give people a chance to get back to their seats. Oh yeah, I'll do the whole thing over again. Oh, bear with me.
We just don't want people walking in during the speaker.
Of course not.
Are we good, Jess?
How are we looking?
Okay.
All right, I have the green light. Sorry to the live stream out there, but again, let's take a second to welcome Danielle.
I remember it like it was yesterday. My family received a phone call one early July morning. My father had been shot and killed from multiple bullets penetrating his right side. I was devastated by my father's murder. My 5-year-old mind could not fully conceptualize the gravity or the permanence of death. I remember my aunt getting down on one knee to share with me face to face the horrific news. All I could imagine is that my father and his friends got into his old school Cutlass and drove over a rainbow. I trusted, I believed, I knew that he would soon return. As I grew older, I turned to books and the church to explore the effects of tragedy and the advantages of faith. My faith, formed and fashioned in a southern rural Black Protestant community, reassured me that trouble doesn't last always. Yet, the more I read, the more I discovered death's finality. What I could not understand as a child that I've come to learn through my research is that we, human beings, determine the power and the vitality of our concepts. Drawing on the best of my own spiritual inheritance, articulates complicated notions of faith and dialogue with despair so that one can understand hopelessness, yet embrace hope. See indifference, but extend compassion. Know suffering, but nonetheless remain faithful. Thus, it is the sheer pervasiveness of Black suffering that drives my research question. I ask, how have faith and despair shaped the Black American Protestant tradition? My research question thinks about it offers a twofold fundamental intervention. I view Black American religious thought as an orientation that seeks to unpack the various and disparate ethical strands within Black faith traditions, and I consider the Black American literary and philosophical traditions as dynamic discourses that informs community and relationality. My hope is that this twofold intervention helps to nuance the everyday lived experience of Black faith practitioners. In 1845, the narrative of Frederick Douglass appeared on bookshelves across this country. Douglass, from slavery to post-escape, exemplifies what it means to stand between faith and despair. In the appendix attached to the end of the book, Douglass raises a strident critique against slaveholding Christianity. Those who subscribe to slaveholding Christianity, Douglass writes, professes to love a God they cannot see, but hate the brother they've seen. Douglass exposes the ironies within slaveholding Christianity and the institution of slavery. One might ask, how can Christianity address the evils of slavery and simultaneously justify enslavement? Well, across the Atlantic Ocean, the 19th century Danish religious and polemical writer Søren Kierkegaard, probably unaware of Douglass, begins to investigate the disparaging Enlightenment rhetoric that fueled American slavery. Kierkegaard contends that love is synonymous with God. Those who call themselves Christians must adhere to two fundamental principles. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. But Kierkegaard stands between faith and despair when he suggests that loving one's neighbor requires embracing the neighbor's ontology and how that neighbor relates to the world. Kierkegaard and Douglass, in their own ways, disentangle these disparate ethical strands of Christianity. I can hear the Black American literary genius Lucille Clifton singing along with Douglas and so many others, saying, "Won't you come celebrate with me, knowing that something has tried to kill me and failed." You see, some modern-day discourses suggest that the plight of Black folks have scarred their souls so much that they would rather disengage or succumb to some of the pathological inerrancies of white supremacy and hegemony rather than living their lives or existing. This is why my research matters. This is what the dialogical relationship between faith and despair seeks to unpack. That despite the ongoing creations of white supremacy to stifle Black existence and deny their beings, Black faith practitioners have historically deployed a blood-soaked notion of faith to mitigate the obstructiveness and bleakness of despair. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I mean, I'm not even gonna lie, I could have listened to that all day. Powerful work. Our next speaker today is Kristin Kimball, a doctoral candidate in Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences. Today, she asks, how can paleoclimate research inform future climate predictions? Please welcome Kristin.
We've all heard that Earth's climate is changing, but how exactly will it change in the next 20, 50, 100 years? Climate scientists know that recent extreme weather events, like flooding, droughts, and wildfires, are very likely exacerbated by anthropogenic or human-induced climate change. But how can we predict what Earth's future climate will be like if the changes we're experiencing today are unprecedented in the course of human history? We have to peer into Earth's past to find examples of how our climate may change in the future. My research reconstructs Earth's ancient climate, specifically from 3 million years ago, when the Earth was much warmer than it is today. And this provides possible guidelines for Earth's climate state by the end of the 21st century. I focus on the tropical Pacific Ocean, where there are currently large differences in 1, the temperature of water at the surface of the ocean, and 2, the productivity of that surface water. And by productivity, I mean the abundance and activity of primary producers, or tiny algae that live at the surface and photosynthesize, or take energy from the sun to grow. The tropical Pacific is also home to a climate cycle called El Niño, which disrupts these patterns of productivity and temperature and contributes to the devastation of extreme weather events that affect people on either side of the Pacific. My research is the first time anyone has looked at multiple sites across the Pacific to try to figure out if El Niño events were more common 3 million years ago, and whether we're heading that way again in the near future. But how do I actually reconstruct climate conditions from millions of years in the past? Well, I use sediment from the bottom of the ocean as physical records of Earth's climate history. A research vessel traveled to the middle of the Pacific Ocean and drilled through hundreds of meters of mud on the seafloor to retrieve a sediment core. Because sediment is continuously deposited layer by layer on the ocean floor, I can construct a timeline with clues about Earth's ancient climate. Within the sediment core, I am on the lookout for organic molecules and fossilized skeletons that can tell me this story about the past. These skeletons and molecules are produced by phytoplankton, so single-celled organisms that live at the ocean's surface and record the surrounding climate conditions from the time they were alive. For example, one phytoplankton I study produces a molecule that looks slightly different in warmer versus colder waters. I also find a greater amount of this molecule when surface productivity is high, so I can map out past trends in productivity and temperature based on the ratio and abundance of these molecules. Although living phytoplankton are found at the surface of the ocean, when they die, they sink to the seafloor, and their molecules and skeletons are preserved in the sediment that I then study. I can use these biological clues to reconstruct past temperature and productivity trends to try to evaluate whether El Niño conditions were dominant 3 million years ago. My research suggests that even though the tropical Pacific was significantly warmer in the past, primary productivity was relatively high, and that's completely different from modern El Niño events, where warm water accompanies a crash in productivity off the coast of South America. Climate scientists still don't have a good sense of how El Niño cycles will respond to anthropogenic or human-induced global warming, but my research fills in gaps in these predictions. My results suggest that even though droughts and flooding may become more severe in the coming decades, the productivity story is much more complex because warm water may be able to support thriving phytoplankton and fish communities. In conclusion, by reconstructing Earth's past climate, I am able to inform predictions for what Earth's climate may look like by the end of this century. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. Joining us on our stage now is Bao Li Young. Bao Li is a doctoral candidate in comparative literature. Please join me in welcoming Bao Li, whose talk is entitled Resurrecting Sleeping Medieval Asian Manuscripts. Bao Li.
I received a lot of feedback after starting my research on medieval Chinese writing. My mom would jokingly ask me, "Don't you feel..." I need the controller, excuse me. I received a lot of feedback after starting my research on medieval Chinese writing. My mom jokingly asked me, "Don't you feel that you are 1,000 years old staring at those old papers all day, every day?" The old papers she refers to are the manuscripts from ancient cultural sites, like this. As you can tell, this set of manuscripts are messy, lengthy, fragmented, and sometimes could be annoyingly illegible. It takes a lot of paleographical work to decipher them. However, working with them does not make me feel immersed into the remote past. Instead, I use texts like these to answer one important question still relevant today. What can a script do? My research topic, medieval Chinese writing, which I also call Sanskrit, was the written lingua franca in medieval Asia. Owing to the cultural influence of the Chinese Empire, Sanskrit's impact can still be felt in today's Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. Unlike the alphabet in the European languages, such as Greek, Latin, and English, Sanskrit is a logographic writing system with no in-transit pronunciations attached to the written symbols. There has been two approaches to understand the Chinese writings. One is Sinographic studies. The other is Sinophone studies. Those two approaches examine how different communities use Chinese written system to build their own literary traditions and cultural heritage. But the key word in my research, Sanskrit, stresses that it was the writing practices of using Chinese characters that enabled the connectivity in medieval East Asia, boosted mutual understanding, and enhanced cultural preservation. Sanskrit could also embody many other layers of significance. It evinces how cultural memories return to its own autonomy. On this map, you can see that the historians took pains to draw the boundaries among different polities in medieval East Asia and among the 10 military circuits within China's Tang Empire. Nevertheless, with the assistance of Brown's Center for Digital Scholarship, I discovered that the poets based in China proper preferred to write more about the Western regions, which were once not part of the Chinese empire, than the southwest part of the empire. This example shows how the cultural logic subverts the political and the military boundary making. Manuscripts can challenge many assumptions in the established literary canon we inherited as well. Wang Zhaojun, as some of you may know, known as one of the four great beauties from ancient China, was sent by an empire of China to carry out marriage diplomacy with a tribal chieftain. In the received literature, Wang Zhaojun is treated as an example to vent out male elites' political frustration in the court. But the frontier regions have a different take on this character in literature. In the old border town, Dunhuang, we discovered a manuscript like this. This manuscript portrayed Wang Zhaojun as an articulate lady, reflecting on her imperial agenda and defying her fate. In another border town, Karakoto, we discovered this woodblock painting. On this painting, you can tell that Wang Zhaojun became a literate person, inscribing on an object. Along with many other examples, Wang Zhaojun tells us medieval East Asian culture is much richer and more diverse than the later print culture presented us. Written words have power. My study on Sino-script culture demonstrates that the power of writing does not only belong to the Chinese empire, who tried to hegemonize its cultural capital, but it also belongs to the people who use it every day in East Asia. Thank you.
I can only imagine how much patience and care has to go into transcribing all of those manuscripts. So I appreciate you taking the time to bring all of that history to us today in this talk. Thank you so much, Baoli. Our next speaker today will be none other than Jorge Ledesma. Jorge is going to be talking to us today on the global burden of tuberculosis, from evidence to action. Jorge comes from the epidemiology department here at Brown, and we want to go ahead and take a second to welcome Jorge to the stage.
I first learned about tuberculosis growing up in a small town in Nebraska. Tuberculosis, or TB for short, became the topic of discussion in my town one day because there's actually cattle at the farm where my dad worked at that became infected with TB. At the time, I didn't think much about it. I only knew from my dad that TB was a disease that can make cows very sick. But other than that, being a little boy, I didn't care much about it. But fast forward 15 years later, I now study TB on a daily basis. And I learned that TB doesn't just affect cattle, but it's a major, major global health problem. So let me start with why TB remains such a public health challenge and why my research on tuberculosis matters. In the last 200 years, it's estimated that TB has killed more than 1 billion people. That is over 1/8 of today's global population. It has killed more people in this time frame than other major infectious diseases like smallpox, cholera, HIV, malaria, plague, flu, all combined, which are some major infectious diseases you may be more familiar with. And in the years leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic, it was still the leading infectious cause of death, killing more than 1.4 million people and causing over 10 million infections per year. Tuberculosis is primarily a lung disease, mainly impacting the poorest people of the planet, because it really is a disease of overcrowding and unequal access to care. It all starts when a patient with active tuberculosis coughs up the bacteria, and someone breathes it in, causing them to be infected. We know that around 2 billion people worldwide are estimated to be infected with latent tuberculosis. Luckily, or there's only 1.4 million of these people die, but still, it's just way too many. Despite the public health relevance and importance of tuberculosis, many countries, particularly low to middle income countries, do not know the true burden of TB within their communities. At the global level, it's estimated that only about 60% of all infections are detected by surveillance systems, and detection is even worse for mortality. It is thought that in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, only about 30% of all deaths, regardless if they're caused by TB or not, are actually detected by registration systems. To provide an illustration of this, the map here is showing how well countries are performing in their vital statistics and registration systems. As you can see, in many parts of Africa and Asia, there is either no systems in place, or the systems are performing at a very low level. And in the very rare case that there is data available, it's often of very poor quality. For example, due to stigma associated with other major infectious diseases like HIV, for instance, many countries actually misclassify HIV deaths as TB deaths, creating huge issues for trying to understand the true burden of TB, but also for trying to understand the burden of other major infectious diseases as well. In the absence of robust data, I'm collaborating with a leading global health research institute called the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, and with over 300 tuberculosis experts and policymakers worldwide. In these collaborations, I'm leading the modeling efforts to estimate the burden of tuberculosis for every country in the world. The goal of our research is to provide evidence so countries can implement data-driven interventions so they can eliminate TB within their communities. To this end, I'm leading work that leverages advanced machine learning algorithms with complex mathematical modeling using over 25,000 sources of data to estimate TB incidence and mortality for over 240 countries and territories from 1990 to the year 2020. To provide an illustration of the types of data that I'm working with, the figure here shows how many data points we have for tuberculosis mortality worldwide. As you can see, we have data in many parts of the world, but unfortunately, again, where TB burden is typically the highest, which is in parts of Africa and Asia, there's little to no data. This is why we're leveraging state-of-the-art data analytics that borrows information from surrounding countries, but also from 20 highly predictive covariates. Utilizing these methods, we can transform this partially data-sparse map into a new and complete map like this that provides robust and validated estimates of TB burden across space and time. Our work to date has provided significant results for trying to understand the burden of TB at the global level. For example, we're finding that there's been such stagnant progress in reducing the burden of TB that the number of annual infections today are actually the same as they were 3 decades ago. Further, we're finding such alarming increases in the prevalence of drug-resistant TB that drug-resistant strains now account for over 10% of all TB-related deaths today. And lastly, our results are confirming that TB is primarily concentrated in low-resource settings, as we're finding that around 80 to 90% of all cases and deaths are occurring in low-resourced areas. And I'll conclude with one last point of why my research on tuberculosis matters. As we have seen, TB is a disease disproportionately affecting the poorest people of the planet. In the span of this 5-minute presentation, it is estimated that there are 100 new cases of TB and that 15 people have died due to the disease. Our work is critical because it's providing countries with robust metrics and data so they can end the TB epidemic within their communities and ultimately at the global level. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. Our next speaker, Coro Harris, is a doctoral candidate in chemistry, excuse me. Coro's talk is entitled, Making Tough Polymers with Green Nanocatalysts. Please join me in welcoming Coro to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming and staying towards the latter half of our research talks. I know it's been a long evening, but I promise if you lend me your ears for a little bit longer, I'll give you another gem to listen to. As the kind introduction that was offered on my behalf stated, I am a chemist, and like the other chemists in the room will attest, we spend our day-to-day work sitting around thinking about seemingly contradictory and almost impossible problems that seem that way from the outset. But if you take a fundamental understanding of the materials that we're working with and tweak them slightly, you can arrive at ingenious solutions. Take polybenzoxazole, or PBO, as an example. This polymer should be a household name. It's twice as strong as Kevlar, it weighs the same, and it's stable up to 650 degrees Celsius. For those of you like me that operate in Fahrenheit, that's the equivalent of incredibly hot. It's like 1200 degrees, much toastier than your oven. And yet, why isn't this not everywhere? Why aren't we using this to line our police officers' bulletproof vests or our firefighters' protective coats? Why is this not being used to protect satellite equipment up in space? It goes back to that contradictory problem. You see, PBO is incredibly strong, and because of that, it's hard to mold. How do you take something that's a rigid rod of plastic and flatten it out into a sheet? Or take it and other rods and weave them together to form a fiber without snapping it in the process? Well, I can tell you what the industry has done. The industry standard for PBO uses acids, like polyphosphoric acid, to soften the fiber, make it more moldable so they can form it into fibers. But as you can clearly see in the two circles up here, it's not just PBO anymore. There's acid contaminants left over that actively degrade the fiber. When the PBO fiber comes into contact with water, PPA helps to degrade it, breaking it and losing all of those desirable characteristics. So I and my lab mates, we sat around and we stroked our chins and thought, okay, how do we access the strength of PBO without dealing with the strength of PBO? Okay. We took it to the drawing board and we said, okay, here's the structure. Let's backtrack all the way back to the beginning, the most basic components, the monomers of the polymer structure. And we said, okay, if we do this correctly and use our lab's specialty, nanoparticle catalysts, little itty-bitty pieces of metal like copper oxide, we can take these precursors and through a series of chemical reactions, convert them into what we call pre-PBO. It's like PBO, but it has these little organic chains that hang off of it. And those organic chains play really nicely with common organic solvents and allow us to take our some 19,000 long unit polymer and make it completely soluble. And you might say, like, that's incredible, but the one PBO expert in the audience is like, hey, don't get too chuffed. The industry standard is 40,000 and you're spitting 19. How does it stand up to the industry standard? Well, thank you, knowledgeable member of the audience. But we took both of our polymers and we dunked them in boiling seawater, remember the water problem, for a week. And yet, our polymer, despite being less than half the length of the industry standard, came out on top with better strength retention and strength performance on par with the 40,000. So now, where do we go? The story's done, everybody pack up your bags, let's go home. No, right? What about our police officers and our firefighters? They still need protective materials. So I, and those who have noticed our research at NASA, have funded my research moving into the next year to solve that problem, to take our now soluble pre-PBO in its solvent form, lay it out to make a thin, controlled sheet, a coating that we can use to protect the people that need it, those here on the ground and those up in the stars. That's why my research matters. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Coro. I look forward to your work on vibranium. So, we conclude our event with the research of Joe Kalishaw, a doctoral candidate in Slavic studies. He's going to share his work with us on Russian cityscapes in history in a talk entitled 1,000 Years in Russian Cultural Memory. Please give Joe a warm welcome.
talking took up more time than expected. I have the pleasure today of presenting on a very light but a very pressing topic, Russian cultural memory, and in particular the premise of 1,000 years of history and how it is being crafted into the official Russian national identity. Since as early as 2004, the Russian political center has laid claim to 1,000 years of history, a view that is imbued with stability and continuity. It seems contradictory when even a cursory glance over the last 100 years of Russian history is anything but stable, with at least 4 independent polities inhabiting the Russian space. I believe that at the heart of this puzzle is the attempt of the Russian political center to reconcile rupture with narratives of stability. And I argue the most clear example of this are the attempts to bridge Russia's imperial past to its present, through rehabilitating core facets of the Russian Empire's Belle Epoque, such as the First World War, the reign of Nicholas II, and the revolutions of 1917. This has been achieved by subtly changing focus and interpretations of these periods through rhetoric, speeches, official cultural practices, commemoration, and even physical space, so as to support contemporary cultural and political practices. Now, I'm sure a few of you are wondering why this really rather subtly English person is talking to you about Russia and Russian culture. The short answer is that as a child, I struggled and hated to read. To remedy this, my grandmother would force encyclopedias and atlases on me, pointing to things and places she knew and telling me about them. And the great landmass of Russia grabbed my attention and sparked my passion for all things Russian. And at 18, my grandmother took me to Russia for the first time. On our first day, we walked out onto Red Square, and this is Red Square, in case you didn't know. And I was struck by the physical complexities that the legacies of the Soviet Union and of the Russian Empire and what they have to do with Russia today. Prime of place on the square over here is Lenin's Mausoleum, a monument to the central figure of communism. A stone's throw from a department store with all of the luxury goods you could possibly want. Both are in the shadow of the Kremlin. It is a physical manifestation of how the Russia of today relates and reconciles to its various pasts. A question that is often asked is, what makes Russia special? I think the answer is relatively simple. Its history, its language, its literature, and its culture are so various and so diverse. So too is the manner in which the Russian political center engages with its wider population. At the heart of this engagement is history and the past in informing official narratives and official interpretations of Russian national identity. History is alive. It's not something that academics write down and talk about in their offices or something we forget about. It imbues our being, our cultures, and the spaces that we inhabit. It is a constant process of sorting views, opinions, and narratives to fit the wants and needs of the day. Absolutely, speeches, rhetorics, film, educational resources are vital to this reading and form a really big part of my research. But we've also got to account for often overlooked areas as well, like the use of physical space. No clearer is this determination to bridge the past to the present than with the construction of the monument to the heroes of World War I. Opened in 2014 at Moscow's Paklanaya Gora, a memorial complex to World War II. World War I has long been seen as the forgotten war of Russian history, as the Soviets cast their historical year zero to 1917. The war became a symbol of all that was wrong with the Russian Empire, and with the Russian Empire's defeat, the memory of the war just drifted into obscurity. However, in constructing this monument on the hallowed ground of the memory of World War II, one of, if not the key tenets of contemporary cultural memory and identity in Russia, there is a clear signal being sent. The war and its place in history is to be taken out from the past and embraced by the present. The monument, with its depiction of men jumping heroically forward, also echoes other representations of war in Russia. Heroism and patriotism are front and center, showing how it is a key thematic insight into how the past is meant to relate to the present, and inform this national identity that is being promoted from the political center. Now more than ever, we need to learn to read. My research matters because if we want to understand the present, we need to learn to look at the past and see how these cultural practices that are being built up around it are being applied today. Only then, when we have learned to read, can we hope for a better future and a better dialogue. Thank you.
What a great talk to end on. More than ever, we really need scholars like Joe who are making vivid to us what scholars of Russia can contribute. I know in my next walkthrough of Providence, I'm going to be thinking about how I can read our cultural narratives in our cityscape as well. I'm inspired by the range of topics we learned about today. I'm especially struck by how our speakers are putting together rich information from partial knowledge, whether it's learning about the water temperature of the tropical Pacific Ocean 3 million years ago, building robust models for TB prevalence, charting swamps and wetlands, which I know to be now critical work, or building a narrative of women in the Middle Ages, stories that have been left untold. We have learned not to be too sanguine about the strengths of our moral commitments, as they may waver under different conditions. And I may not be the expert in the audience on PBO, but I'm delighted to learn about it, and I'm inspired to hear about the work that is being done here at Brown. And the research that our speakers presented today gives us hope. Indeed, helped us understand hope and how hope and despair can be in dialogical relationship to each other. The research of these graduate students is making a difference. That came out again and again, whether it's in helping develop more effective wound dressings, identifying the correct culprit behind air pollution, and to help those with PTSD. I also learned a new key term, sinoscript, and enjoyed learning about the relevance today of medieval Asian manuscripts. And I'm so glad you were all here, and I'm hopeful that some of the people we heard about have also had the occasion to watch on the live stream or will see the videos later. So I hope Danielle's aunt may join us or is joining us. I hope Baoli's mother is able to see her talk as well. And I'm really grateful for all the audience members here, and especially the advisors and your colleagues and your lab mates and your classmates who've supported you through all of your research that you have really brought to light today. I'd like, of course, to thank our technical team who've been fantastic. I want to thank all of our helpers in events and strategy management, our wonderful graphics work. I want to thank especially the music department for hosting us also in this terrific space. So I want to thank you again for joining the celebration of graduate students and graduate student research, and I think all of our speakers deserve a huge round of applause for what they've done. Thanks again. Look for the videos in about a week, and please join us and congratulate our speakers outside.